Some killers don't wait in shadows. They wait in plain sight, with calm voices, soft touches, and promises they never meant to keep. These 5 didn't lash out in rage. They rehearsed, they timed every move, and by the time their girlfriends felt the shift, it was already over. Before I take you through how love turned into a death sentence, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now, and subscribe, because in these cases, the last thing they heard wasn't a scream. It was, "I forgive you." Daniel Cross was not the kind of man who shouted or showed anger in the open. He believed that quiet was stronger than noise, that patience was sharper than rage. When his girlfriend Julia told him she had been meeting another man behind his back, she expected him to yell, to slam the door, to threaten her. Instead, he nodded slowly, said he understood, and told her to take time to think about what she wanted. That moment convinced Julia that he was calm and forgiving. But for Daniel, it was the moment he decided she was never going to walk away from him for someone else. In his mind, betrayal was not something you talked through. Betrayal was a wound that had to be closed forever. Over the next 2 weeks, Daniel acted like nothing was wrong. He cooked her favorite meals, sent her good morning texts, offered to pick her up from work, and talked about trips they could take together. All of it was a performance to make her believe everything was fine. But while she saw kindness, he was planning her death in complete detail. He didn't want a messy scene. He didn't want blood or noise. He wanted a death that would look like an accident so no one would suspect him. He decided the garage would be the perfect place. Julia often went there to grab things from her car, and the space was small and easy to seal. Daniel began to prepare slowly so she would not notice. He replaced the door seal between the garage and the house with thick weather stripping so no air could get in or out. He adjusted the hinges so the door closed tighter than before. He took out her car's carbon monoxide warning fuse so the system would not alert her if something was wrong. He even mentioned to a neighbor that he thought he smelled exhaust in the garage one day, planting a seed in case he needed to explain later. When the setup was ready, he made sure to act more loving than ever. On Friday, he planned a special night for them. He bought steaks, wine, candles, and put on a playlist she liked. He set the table perfectly and made sure the evening felt safe and romantic. When Julia came home, she was smiling, relieved to see him in such a good mood. They talked, laughed, and had dinner like normal. Then she mentioned she had a sweater in her car. Daniel saw his chance. He told her to grab it from the garage so she wouldn't have to walk upstairs. He smiled, told her the keys were in the visor, and said he'd hold the door open for her. The second she stepped inside, he closed the door, clicked the garage remote, and heard the engine come to life from the fob he had left in the cup holder. He didn't rush. He didn't look nervous. He went back to the kitchen, flipped the steaks, poured more wine, and waited, knowing that in just minutes the air in that garage would turn into a silent weapon she could not escape from. Daniel had studied everything. He knew how long the engine needed to run before the carbon monoxide would fill the garage. He knew how many minutes Julia could survive before she passed out, and he had planned to check the time twice to stay on schedule. He stood in the kitchen as if nothing was happening, the sound of soft piano music covering the faint hum of the engine. Every so often, he glanced at the clock on the microwave, counting the minutes in his head. After 8 minutes, he walked quietly to the garage door and pressed his ear against it. He could hear the low, steady sound of the car running and imagined the air inside changing from something safe to something deadly. He smiled to himself, convinced that no one would ever know what happened. But perfect plans rarely stay perfect. He didn't hear the delivery van pulling up outside. The driver came to the door and took a proof of delivery photo, as required by the company. In the reflection of the glass panel next to the door, the photo captured Daniel standing sideways, his head turned toward the garage. That photo would later become one of the biggest pieces of evidence against him. At around the 12-minute mark, Daniel returned to the kitchen, pretending to focus on cooking. He poured more wine, arranged the plates, and kept his face calm in case anyone saw him. At 14 minutes, he decided it was enough. He walked to the garage, opened the door just enough to slip inside, and switched off the car. Julia was slumped in the driver's seat, her head tilted, eyes closed, lips slightly parted. He touched her wrist, no pulse. Daniel's next move was to make it look like he had just discovered her. He flung the interior door wide open, shouted her name, and ran to the phone to call 911. His voice on the call was calm at first, then raised in fake panic as he told them she must have gone to get something from the car and never came back. But even during that call, he made a mistake. He said her keys were still in the visor, something he could not have known if he had truly just found her. When paramedics arrived, they noticed there was no smell of exhaust in the house, which meant the door between the garage and kitchen had been tightly sealed. Police began to question why. They searched the garage and found brand new weather stripping that matched a receipt on Daniel's credit card from just days earlier. They checked Julia's car and saw that the carbon monoxide alert system fuse had been removed and loosely replaced. Then they examined Daniel's phone. What they found was a long history of searches about how long until CO kills and car exhaust lethal ppm, all done in the weeks before her death. Combined with the delivery photo and the statements from neighbors about Daniel mentioning smelling exhaust in the garage, the evidence painted a clear picture. Daniel had not acted in the heat of passion. He had planned every step. The jury didn't take long to decide. They found him guilty of first-degree murder. Julia's family listened to the verdict in silence, some in tears, others just staring at him without speaking. Daniel showed no reaction. For him, the plan had been perfect until it wasn't, and it was the smallest, most random details, a photo reflection, a missing fuse, a credit card receipt, that turned his quiet crime into an open confession. Daniel's story ended in a courtroom, but not every betrayal killer leaves a trail as easy to follow. Some don't use sealed rooms or complicated tools at all. They choose a weapon that's always at hand and a setting where no one questions why the couple is alone. That's how the next man made sure his girlfriend's last breath came in a place she thought was safe, her own living room. Mark Hanley was the kind of boyfriend who seemed too tired to argue and too soft-spoken to threaten anyone. He worked long hours as a house painter, came home smelling of turpentine and dust, and spent his evenings half asleep on the couch while his girlfriend Claire scrolled her phone. That routine made him seem harmless, the man who never noticed much, the man who didn't care enough to fight. But behind his drooping eyelids was a man who had been watching in silence. He knew she'd been meeting someone else, knew she was laughing at messages she quickly deleted, and knew she was only still living with him because she couldn't afford rent on her own. Mark didn't explode when he found out. He didn't pack her things or demand an explanation. He decided she was going to die in a way that would leave him holding her hand while the life drained out of her, making everyone believe he had tried to save her. His plan was simple but deadly: poison. Not a dramatic, fast-acting kind, but one that could be slipped into something she drank every day, something she wouldn't think twice about. For weeks, he researched on his phone late at night while she was asleep beside him. He looked for substances that had no taste, no smell, and symptoms that looked like a natural illness. He settled on a liquid pesticide used in certain industrial cleaners, something he could get from a job site without anyone asking questions. He tested it on plants in the backyard, watching them wilt within hours. Once he was sure, he began adding it in tiny amounts to the orange juice Claire drank every morning. The doses were small enough not to kill her right away, but enough to weaken her over time. Headaches, nausea, stomach pain. She blamed stress and skipped meals, which only made her weaker. Mark acted concerned, bringing her soup, offering to make her tea, even suggesting she take the day off work. All the while, He was slowly moving toward the final dose. The night he chose, he set the scene perfectly. He cleaned the living room, lit a few candles, and put on a movie she liked. He poured her a glass of juice, just like always, but this time with a full lethal dose mixed in. She sipped it between bites of dinner, unaware of what was inside. Mark sat close to her, asking if she was feeling any better. About 30 minutes later, she began to look pale, her breathing shallow. She said she felt dizzy. He told her to lie back on the couch, holding her hand and telling her to rest. Within minutes, she was slipping away, and by the time she stopped breathing, Mark already had the 911 script in his head. She had been feeling sick for weeks. He had been taking care of her, and then she just collapsed. To anyone else, it would sound like a man who had tried to save his girlfriend. To Mark, it was the final act of a plan he'd been perfecting for months. Mark thought the scene he had staged was perfect. The juice glass sat half empty on the coffee table, the candles flickered like any normal evening, and Claire's body was positioned naturally on the couch as if she had just fallen asleep. When paramedics arrived, they found him kneeling beside her, his hands shaking, his voice breaking as he told them he had tried CPR but nothing worked. He spoke in short, panicked sentences, throwing in little details about her recent stomach flu and bad headaches, so it would sound like he was giving them useful medical history. At first, no one questioned it. Claire was young, but sudden medical events happened. They loaded her into the ambulance, and Mark followed closely behind in his truck, playing the part of the worried partner. At the hospital, she was pronounced dead, and the cause of death was initially listed as cardiac arrest. Mark thought he had gotten away with it, but trouble started almost immediately. One of Claire's friends, who had been at the house a week earlier, told police that Claire had been complaining about feeling sick for days and suspected something was wrong with the juice she had been drinking. She had even joked, "Maybe Mark's trying to poison me," before laughing it off. That offhand comment lodged in the detectives' minds, and when they checked her phone, they found multiple messages to friends saying she was feeling weaker every day and didn't know why. Some of the messages mentioned that Mark was the one making her drinks. That was enough for investigators to request a toxicology report. It took time, but when the results came back, they showed high levels of an organophosphate compound, a pesticide, in her system. That finding alone raised alarms. Organophosphates are not found naturally in the human body, and accidental ingestion is rare unless the person works directly with such chemicals. Claire didn't, but Mark did. As a house painter and occasional construction worker, he had access to industrial-grade solvents, cleaners, and pesticides used to prep certain work areas. Detectives checked his work history and found that one of the job sites he had been at 2 months before the poisoning kept the exact chemical found in Claire's body. They then obtained search warrants for his phone and home. On his phone, they found late-night searches for poisons that can't be traced, slow-acting poisons, and how much pesticide will kill a person. The searches had been done over several weeks, always late at night when Claire would have been asleep. In his shed, hidden behind paint cans, they found a half-empty container of the same pesticide from his job site. It had fingerprints on it. His. Investigators also found a small glass bottle with residue that matched the toxic compound. When confronted, Mark claimed the pesticide was for yard work and that he had no idea how it got into Claire's system. But the case against him only grew stronger. Detectives interviewed neighbors who remembered Mark asking strange questions about what happens if someone drinks a little bit of cleaner and how fast it would make them sick. A co-worker also told police that Mark had once asked if anyone would notice if you poured a small capful of something into orange juice. The final blow came from the medical examiner's timeline. The levels of poison in Claire's body suggested a pattern of exposure, meaning she had been ingesting it in small amounts for weeks before the lethal dose. That matched perfectly with her texts to friends about feeling sick over time. It also matched with receipts from the grocery store showing that Mark had been buying the same brand of orange juice repeatedly over the last month, always on his way home from work. Prosecutors argued that this was part of his control, making sure the drink came from him, so no one else could be blamed. In court, the jury listened to recordings of his police interviews, where he tried to sound heartbroken but stumbled over basic details. When asked which glass Claire had been drinking from that night, he said, "The one in the kitchen," before being told it had been found on the coffee table. When asked what time she started feeling sick, he said, "After dinner." But a neighbor's doorbell camera showed her stepping outside to get some air nearly an hour before they ate. These inconsistencies, combined with the mountain of physical and digital evidence, left little doubt. The jury found him guilty of first-degree murder, and the judge sentenced him to life without parole. For Claire's friends and family, the hardest part wasn't the method he used. It was the patience behind it. Mark had watched her get weaker day by day, had listened to her complain about feeling sick, had even comforted her while knowing he was the one causing it. His calmness during those weeks became the most disturbing detail in the case. Detectives later said that what made Mark dangerous wasn't his access to poison. It was his ability to wait, to make his victim believe he was helping her right until the end. In their eyes, that patience was as much a weapon as the chemical itself. Mark's weapon had been a clear glass of juice, something no one thought twice about until it was too late. But the next killer didn't bother with subtle doses or slow endings. He believed betrayal deserved something instant, something brutal, and he made sure his girlfriend's last moments were loud enough for the neighbors to hear, but not soon enough for anyone to save her. Ethan Cole was not the kind of man who planned for weeks or researched perfect crimes. He was the type who acted fast, with decisions that felt like instinct, but were really built on years of carrying grudges. He worked as a mechanic in a small town, knew everyone's names, and had a reputation for fixing cars cheaply if you treated him right. When he found out that his girlfriend, Megan, had been seeing a man she'd met at the gym, something inside him locked into place. He didn't shout at her or demand the truth. He simply said he understood and that maybe they needed to talk things through in private. That private talk became his plan. Ethan's thinking was simple. Betrayal had to be punished in the same place trust was built. For them, that place was his garage, the same spot where she had spent hours watching him work, handing him tools and drinking beer while they talked about the future. He knew she felt safe there, and he was going to use that against her. For 2 days, he cleaned the space until it looked like a showroom, sweeping up every trace of oil and grease, organizing the shelves, even hanging a new light over the workbench. Megan thought he was doing it for a big client job, but it was all for her. The lure was easy. He called her on a Friday night, saying he needed help looking at a special project and wanted her opinion. She agreed without hesitation. When she arrived, Ethan had set up the scene. A bottle of her favorite cider on the counter, 2 folding chairs placed side by side, and a radio playing quietly in the corner. He told her he wanted to show her something under the hood of a car he was restoring for a friend. What she didn't know was that inside the trunk of that car was a heavy steel pipe, cut to the perfect length for him to swing with one arm while the other held her in place. He kept the pipe hidden under a folded blanket, ready for the moment he wanted. Megan leaned over the engine bay as Ethan talked about spark plugs and timing belts, her guard completely down. The conversation shifted, first casual, then about us, then about the betrayal he knew about. She tried to explain, to say she didn't mean to hurt him. He nodded as if he understood, stepping closer, placing his hand lightly on her shoulder like he had 100 times before. And then, without raising his voice or giving any warning, he reached into the trunk, grabbed the pipe, and swung. The first hit was to the side of her head, hard enough to make her drop forward onto the fender. The second came before she could even cry out. The music from the radio covered the sound just enough that no one outside would notice. Ethan didn't stop until she was still, the cider bottle untouched, the folding chairs waiting for a conversation that would never happen. Ethan stood over Megan's body for a long moment, breathing hard, the steel pipe still in his hand. The garage felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier, as if the walls themselves knew what had just happened. He told himself he needed to act fast. He dragged her body to the back corner of the garage where an old tarp lay folded. He wrapped her in it and tied the ends with duct tape, his hands moving automatically like he was just securing car parts for storage. His plan, if you could call it that, was to load her into the back of his pickup and drive out to a wooded area he used for dumping scrap metal, but already the cracks in his thinking were starting to show. The first mistake was the blood spatter on the front fender of the car. It wasn't much, but it was there. A faint spray that he couldn't wipe away completely without drawing attention to the fact that the car's paint was suddenly cleaner in just one spot. The second mistake was the radio. It had been playing during the attack and he forgot to turn it off before leaving. That would later allow investigators to establish a rough timeline when they saw it still powered on at the exact station she liked, matching the time of her last known call. Ethan's third and biggest mistake was underestimating how quickly Megan's absence would be noticed. Her sister was expecting her that same night for a late dinner and began calling within an hour of her not showing up. When Megan didn't answer, her sister drove past Ethan's place and noticed his truck wasn't in its usual spot in front of the garage. She also thought she saw a bundle in the back of it under a tarp. She didn't stop, but she called police with a gut feeling that something was wrong. Meanwhile, Ethan had driven to the scrap dump site, a narrow dirt track leading into heavy trees. He hauled the wrapped body out of the truck and rolled it down a shallow slope, covering it with more scrap and a sheet of corrugated metal. He thought that would be enough to hide it for weeks. What he didn't count on was the security camera at the scrapyard entrance, a camera he had passed countless times without thinking about it. It caught his truck entering late that night and leaving less than 30 minutes later, the tarp gone from the bed. The next day, Megan's sister filed a missing person report and police visited Ethan. He tried to act concerned, saying he had seen her earlier, but she left to clear her head. Detectives noticed his hands were scraped, and when they asked about it, he claimed he cut himself working on a car. But his story began to fall apart almost immediately. A search warrant for his garage revealed faint blood spots on the fender and on the floor near the workbench. Luminol testing showed a larger stain that had been partially wiped. They also found the cider bottle still unopened, a detail prosecutors would later use to argue that the night had been staged as a lure. The steel pipe was missing, but fragments of paint and metal found on Megan's head wound matched a brand and size consistent with the type Ethan kept in his shop. The clincher came when investigators reviewed the scrapyard camera footage. There was Ethan's truck, tarp covering something in the bed as it went in, empty bed when it came out. Search teams were sent to the site, and within hours they found Megan's body under the metal sheet, still wrapped in the tarp tied with duct tape. Forensics confirmed the blood on the fender, and the tarp matched her DNA. Confronted with the evidence, Ethan tried to claim it was an accident, that she had fallen while helping him work on the car. But the force and pattern of the injuries told a different story. The jury didn't believe him. The timeline, the lure, the cleanup, the dump site. It all fit together too neatly to be anything but deliberate. In court, Megan's sister testified about that night, about seeing his truck and the tarp, her voice shaking as she told the jury she had known something was wrong. The jury took just over 3 hours to convict him of first-degree murder. Ethan showed no emotion as the sentence was read. For detectives, the case was an example of how even killers who think they're being clever make mistakes in the smallest details. a radio left on, a sister who drives by at the right moment, a camera they forget is there. In the end, it wasn't just the violence that caught him, it was the fact that he thought he could hide it in plain sight. Ethan thought the garage would keep his secret, but even steel walls and locked doors couldn't stop the truth from spilling out. The next man didn't try to hide the scene at all. He wanted it found. He wanted the blood, the chaos, and the weapon right where the police would see them, because for him, the crime wasn't just about killing. It was about sending a message. Ryan Mercer was the kind of man who never forgave humiliation. He had grown up in a rough neighborhood, taught from a young age that respect was currency, and once it was stolen from you, you either took it back or you were finished. With his girlfriend Alina, he was intense, possessive, the kind of partner who texted dozens of times a day and always wanted to know where she was. For months, he suspected she was seeing someone else, but had no proof, only the gut feeling that her tone had changed, that her laugh had a new edge to it, that she had started dressing differently when she went out without him. The confirmation came one night when a mutual friend sent him a photo. Alina in another man's car, leaning toward him, smiling in a way Ryan hadn't seen in weeks. In that moment, something in him locked. This wasn't going to be a fight, or a breakup, or a cold silence. This was going to be the kind of lesson she couldn't walk away from. But unlike other men who hide their crimes, Ryan wanted this one to be a warning. He wanted everyone, especially the man she had betrayed him with, to know exactly what happened and why. That's why he decided the scene would be left untouched. He spent days planning, not how to hide it, but how to stage it so the police would see everything and know it was deliberate. He chose their apartment as the stage, a small second-floor unit with a narrow entryway that forced anyone coming in to look straight into the living room. That's where it would happen. Ryan knew Alina came home late on Thursdays from her night class, usually around 9:15. He used the day to prepare, moving the couch back against the wall to give himself more space in the center of the room. He laid down a large plastic tarp over the carpet, big enough to cover the area from the coffee table to the hallway. He took their kitchen knives out of the block and selected one, an 8-inch chef's knife he had sharpened the day before. He set it on the coffee table next to her favorite candle, the one she always lit when she got home. In the hours before she arrived, he practiced in his head how it would happen. There would be no yelling, no warning. She would open the door, see him sitting there calm, maybe even with the TV on. She would think it was just another tense night. But the moment she put down her bag, he would close the distance. The lure wasn't complicated. He didn't need one. She was coming home like always. The key was in making sure she couldn't run or scream loud enough for help to arrive in time. To do that, he wedged a chair under the front door handle from the inside so it would jam if anyone tried to force it open, and he locked the balcony sliding door so there was no way out that way either. At 9:12, he heard her footsteps on the stairs, the jingle of her keys. His heart pounded, but his face stayed blank. She walked in, tossed her bag on the chair by the door, and looked at him with suspicion. "What's going on?" she asked. He didn't answer. He just stood, slow and steady, the knife already in his right hand. She froze, realizing too late that the coffee table had been moved, the couch pushed back, the floor covered in something that caught the light. She turned toward the door, but the chair jammed it shut. By the time she faced him again, he was already in front of her. He didn't shout. He didn't call her names. He drove the knife forward in a single, brutal motion aimed at her chest. The shock in her eyes lasted only a second before she staggered back, tripping over the edge of the tarp. She tried to crawl, leaving streaks behind her, but he followed, methodical, each step closing the distance until there was nowhere left to go. The final blow was not quick. He wanted her to see him, to know who was ending it, and to remember in her last moments exactly why. When it was done, he sat back on the couch, breathing slow, the knife still in his hand, and looked at the scene around him. This wasn't something to clean up. This was something to display. He made no move to hide the weapon, the tarp, or the body. In his mind, the scene was the message, and the police were just the audience he had invited. Ryan didn't call anyone after it was over. He didn't run. He sat on the couch for nearly an hour, the TV still playing in the background, the knife resting loosely in his right hand. He could hear the faint hum of traffic outside and footsteps on the stairs as neighbors came and went, unaware of what lay just feet away behind his front door. Eventually, he stood and walked into the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and drank it slowly. He looked at the clock, 10:27 p.m., then sat back down, waiting for someone else to make the first move. That someone was a neighbor named Greg, who had heard a loud thud earlier but thought nothing of it. At 10:42, Greg knocked on Ryan's door to borrow some sugar. When there was no answer, he tried the handle, but the door wouldn't open more than an inch because of the chair jammed under it. He bent to look through the crack and saw the edge of the tarp and a pool of something dark spreading toward the entryway. Greg backed away fast and called 911. Ryan heard the neighbor's voice outside but didn't move. When the police arrived minutes later, they had to force the door open. The chair gave way with a splintering sound, and the first officer froze for a split second at what he saw. The tarp was soaked through, the body lying in the center of it, the knife still on the coffee table as if it had been placed there for display. Ryan was sitting on the couch, leaning back, hands resting on his knees. His face was calm, almost blank, but his eyes followed every movement the officers made. When they told him to get on the ground, he complied without a word. The first thing investigators noticed was how staged everything felt. The tarp was too neat, the couch too deliberately positioned, the candle still burning on the coffee table. There were no signs of a struggle outside the tarp area. No overturned chairs, no broken glass, which told them the attack had happened entirely within the space Ryan had prepared. They photographed everything: the knife, the placement of the body, the locked balcony door, and the chair that had jammed the entry. Blood spatter patterns confirmed what they suspected. The attack had started just inside the front door, with the victim pushed or stepping back onto the tarp almost immediately. Ryan's clothes were clean except for the sleeves, which had faint droplets near the cuffs. The medical examiner would later note that the wounds were deliberate, targeted, and delivered with enough force to indicate someone who knew exactly what they were doing. In the kitchen trash, detectives found the packaging from a new tarp purchased earlier that day. A receipt in the bag matched a hardware store a few blocks away, and security footage from that store showed Ryan buying the tarp and a new roll of duct tape at 11:04 a.m. They also found the sharpening steel he had used on the knife, still sitting on the counter. When asked why he hadn't tried to hide anything, Ryan's answer was simple: "I wanted them to see." He didn't deny killing Alina. In fact, he seemed almost proud of how clean the scene was. What he didn't realize was that his openness didn't protect him. It destroyed any chance of arguing it was an accident or self-defense. Prosecutors built their case around the idea that the murder was not only premeditated but intentionally staged to intimidate. They pointed to the purchased tarp, the knife sharpening, the blocking of the exits, and the deliberate waiting for her to arrive as proof of planning. In court, the photos of the scene had a chilling effect on the jury. The stillness of the room, the way everything seemed placed rather than left by chance, gave the impression of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his mind many times. Witnesses testified about Ryan's jealousy, his controlling behavior, and the way he reacted to rumors about Alina's relationship with another man. The neighbor, Greg, recounted seeing the dark pool under the door and the tarp edge before calling 911. The hardware store clerk testified about selling Ryan the tarp and tape, remembering how he had made a joke about home projects when she rang him up. The defense tried to argue that Ryan had acted in the heat of the moment. that seeing Alina that night had triggered a rage he couldn't control. But the evidence told a different story. The timeline of purchases, the rearranging of furniture, the blocking of exits. None of that happens in a split-second rage. It happens when someone has time to think, to plan, to prepare. The jury took less than a day to return a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Ryan was sentenced to life without parole. In the aftermath, detectives called the case one of the most unsettling they'd worked, not because of the level of violence, they had seen worse, but because of the deliberate calm. One officer said he was sitting there like it was just another night in front of the TV. For Alina's family, the hardest part to accept was that she had walked into her own home thinking it was a safe place, not knowing that every object in that room had been placed there for the purpose of killing her. The scene Ryan left behind became the story, a room turned into a stage, a murder turned into a message, and a killer who wanted everyone to read it. Ryan left his message in plain sight, certain that fear would last longer than the blood on the floor. But the next man didn't want witnesses, photos, or a staged scene. He wanted his girlfriend to vanish so completely that people would question if she had ever been there at all. And he was willing to carry out every step in silence to make that happen. Adrian Locke had always been the kind of man who blended into the background. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, and most people who met him forgot his face within days. That was how he liked it, quiet enough to watch people without them realizing they were being watched. With his girlfriend, Leah, that same quiet nature seemed gentle at first, even comforting. She called him her safe place, the man who listened more than he spoke. But to Adrian, listening wasn't love, it was surveillance. He noticed every change in her routine, every shift in tone, every unexplained absence. For months he had suspected there was someone else, and when he finally confirmed it, an overheard phone call where she laughed in a way she hadn't with him in months. Something inside him snapped into focus. He wasn't going to confront her, and he wasn't going to leave her. He was going to erase her. But unlike most killers, Adrian didn't want a body left behind for anyone to grieve over or investigate. He wanted her to vanish completely, to be a name people whispered about with no answers. That meant no blood, no scene, no witnesses. He started by building a trap that wouldn't look like one. Leah trusted him completely, so luring her somewhere isolated wouldn't be difficult if he gave her the right reason. He chose an old lakeside cabin that had been in his family for years, a place she had visited once before on a summer trip and loved for its quiet and privacy. He told her he had a surprise for their anniversary, that he wanted to take her back there for a weekend, just the two of them. She smiled and said yes without hesitation. The weeks before the trip, Adrian made quiet preparations. He visited the cabin alone, cleaning it thoroughly so no trace of anyone else would be found later. He stocked the kitchen with enough food for 2 days so they wouldn't need to go into town. He fixed the locks on the doors and windows, replacing them with ones that could only be opened from the outside. He even installed a new latch on the small cellar under the cabin floor, a space originally meant for storing fishing gear, but now cleared out for something much darker. He made sure his truck was tuned up and the gas tank was full. For the final touch, he bought a heavy-duty duffel bag and a large roll of thick plastic sheeting from a hardware store an hour away, paying in cash so there would be no record. When the weekend came, he played the part perfectly. He drove her to the cabin with music playing, making small talk, laughing at old memories. They arrived in the late afternoon, sunlight spilling through the trees as they unloaded their bags. Leah walked out onto the deck, taking in the lake view, never noticing Adrian locking the truck and pocketing the keys without saying a word. Inside, he suggested they open a bottle of wine before dinner. She agreed, and while she poured the glasses, he moved quietly to the small utility closet where he had stashed the chloroform he had ordered weeks earlier from an online seller under a fake name. He soaked a cloth and folded it neatly in his hand before walking back toward her. She was mid-sentence when he stepped behind her, pressing the cloth over her mouth and nose. Her hands shot up, clawing at his arms, but he held her tight, his grip unshakable. Her legs kicked against the table, knocking over the wine, the dark liquid spreading across the wood like a slow shadow. Within seconds, her body went limp. Adrian worked quickly. He lifted her into the duffel bag, tucking her limbs in with practiced movements, then zipped it closed. He carried the bag down the short hallway to the cellar door, opened it, and lowered her inside onto the plastic-covered floor. He locked the latch from the outside and stood there for a moment, listening to the silence. This was only the first step. She wasn't dead yet, but he had no intention of letting her leave that cellar alive. Adrian's plan for the second step was simple on paper but cruel in the way it bent time against Leah. He had no interest in bruises, noise, or scenes. He wanted her to quiet down, to fade, and then to disappear in a way that made the world shrug and move on. After locking the cellar, he set the cabin to look like a normal weekend. A pot on the stove, 2 plates on the counter, the pair of wine glasses, one knocked over from the struggle, rinsed and placed upside down to dry. He wiped the table with a dish towel, then tossed the towel into a bag he would later burn. He checked the door and window locks again, then carried a small camping lantern and a bottle of water back to the cellar hatch. He opened it a crack, listened, and heard only his own breath and the faint drip of water in the pipes. He climbed down the short wooden ladder, set the lantern a few feet from the plastic sheeting, unzipped the duffel, and waited. Leah stirred, a weak sound in her throat, the kind a person makes when the weight of sleep is wrong. When her eyes opened, she saw the dull glow of the lantern, the rough beams of the floor above, and the plastic under her palms. She reached up on reflex, but her hands met the cold metal of the hatch and the lock on the other side. Adrian stood a yard away, just out of reach, his voice low and steady as he told her she was safe, that she'd just passed out for a second, that he would get her some air. She tried to speak, but the words came out thin. He handed her the bottle of water through a gap and watched her drink, saying they would go back upstairs once she could stand. He didn't mean it. He only wanted her awake enough to understand that there were no more choices. After a few minutes, he climbed out and locked the hatch again, pulling the rug back over it to hide the seams. He returned to the kitchen and finished the picture of a normal night. A half-chopped onion, the skillet warming, the cabin smelling faintly of soap and pine. He sent a message from Leah's phone to her friend. "Made it to the lake. Signal is spotty. Back Sunday." Then he shut the phone off, removed the SIM, and slid both into a tin he would later sink. That message would buy him time, the one thing he valued more than anything else in the plan. Back in the cellar, hours passed. Adrian returned twice, each time with water, each time with words designed to slow her down. "Just rest. You're okay. We'll talk in the morning." He kept the lantern dim to make minutes feel like hours. By dawn, Leah was weaker, shaking, her voice hoarse from calling out between bouts of silence. He told himself he was being kind by keeping it quiet. He wasn't. He was extending control. When the sun rose over the lake, he walked down the path to a small cove hidden by reeds. He'd prepared that area days earlier, dragging a heavy canoe to a notch between boulders and hiding a coil of rope and 2 cinder blocks in the brush. He returned to the cabin, ate a simple breakfast, and waited until mid-morning when the still water made no sound and no fisherman's boat cut the surface. Then the final step began. He carried the duffel up from the cellar with slow care, not because he was worried about hurting her, he was already past that, but because he wanted no marks on the floor, no scratches on the hatch that could draw attention. Outside, he paused to scan the tree line. No hikers. No cars on the dirt road. He moved down to the cove, loaded the duffel into the canoe, and shoved off with a flat, practiced stroke. 30 yards from shore, he stopped, breathed in, and set the rope through the bag's handles with tight knots he'd learned as a kid. He tied the other end to the cinder blocks and eased them into the water one by one. The weight dragged the lines down, the bag following, the ripples closing over the spot in seconds until the lake looked exactly as it had 5 minutes earlier. He drifted for a long time, letting the canoe bob in the light breeze, giving the water time to settle. When he came back to shore, he hid the canoe again and erased what paths he could with brush and boot sweeps. Back at the cabin, he staged the last act, the trip home. He washed the dishes, packed both their bags, hers with the clothes she'd brought but leaving out one sweater she always wore so it would look like she left it behind by accident, and placed them in the truck. He double-checked that no hair ties, no earrings, no slips of paper with phone numbers were left visible. Then he locked the cabin, pocketed the keys, and drove back toward town just before sunset. The hour when people notice less because the day is ending and their minds are elsewhere. The next 2 days were built to shape the story. On Monday morning, he texted Leah's boss from her phone again. From a spot with poor reception, saying she had car trouble near the lake and might be late. He parked her phone in a drawer and never turned it on again. He visited Leah's mother that afternoon with a calm face and a bag of groceries, saying Leah had stayed with a friend to clear her head after a small argument. He made tea, washed the cups, and left with a hug. In the evenings, he sat in his apartment and wrote out a timeline of simple acts he could repeat if questioned. Times, places, purchases, each one mundane enough that they would be hard to disprove and pointless to argue against. But the world didn't shrug. Leah's best friend, who knew her patterns and her small tells, started calling within hours of the missed Sunday check-in. When texts went green and stayed that way, the friend drove past Leah's place and then to Adrian's. She noticed his truck was clean. Too clean for a man who usually left dust on the fenders, and that he had a new pair of boots by the door. A day later, Leah's mother filed a missing person report. Detectives began quietly, as they always do before panic spreads. They checked recent calls, bank activity, camera hits. The cabin was on an old family deed in Adrian's name. That came up in the first database sweep. They paid him a visit. He was ready. He told them about the anniversary plan, that Leah had been emotional, that she'd asked him to drive her back to town early, that she'd left his place with a friend's car. He suggested the friend's name before they asked, preloading a path. The detectives took notes, thanked him, and left. But the small things were already wrong. The neighbor across from Adrian's apartment told them she hadn't seen Leah in days. Not even on the weekend, Adrian claimed she returned. A clerk at a rural station remembered him buying cash gas on the lake road and weirdly asking if the station's cameras were working. They were, and the timestamp didn't match his story. When detectives reached the cabin, they found it locked and tidy, too tidy, as if the weekend had been an open house. No fingerprints on the wine glasses, no prints on the stove knobs. The dish towel was missing, and a faint rectangular mark on the table suggested something had sat there and then been cleaned too carefully. They noticed the rug in the living room was positioned a few inches off-center, and nudging it back saw the narrow outline of the cellar hatch. Down below, the plastic sheeting was gone, but an impression remained in the dust, long, bag-shaped, with tape residue in 2 strips. It was not proof of a body, but it was proof of intent. Someone had prepared that space for containment. They found new brass screws on the cellar latch, a hardware store-size bag in the trash with a timestamp. The shop's camera showed Adrian paying cash wearing the new boots the neighbor had noticed. Back in town, a search warrant opened Adrian's truck. Under the rear liner, investigators found tiny pieces of lake reed, a few grains of pale sand that matched a cove soil sample, and a short nylon cut end that matched the rope sold next to the cinder blocks at a hardware store 30 miles from the cabin, the same store where a manager later remembered Adrian because he had asked which ropes sink best for tying dock lines. In his apartment, hidden in a cereal box, detectives found Leah's SIM card wrapped in foil. When asked, Adrian said he'd found it on the floor, but could not explain why he'd keep it hidden if he believed she was off with a friend. The break came from the water. Search teams brought in a side-scan sonar unit and worked the lake in a grid pattern, starting with coves and irregular bottoms where objects settle. On the second afternoon, they found an unusual shadow on the sonar, a rectangular shape with two denser points beside it. Divers went down and returned with a duffel bag weighted by 2 cinder blocks, the zippers wired shut. The bag was intact. The medical examiner would later confirm Leah's identity and the presence of chemical traces in her hair that matched controlled chloroform. The wire on the zippers was from the same brand spool found in Adrian's garage. Every careful step he'd taken had left a matching imprint somewhere else. The boot purchase, the gas station camera, the hardware receipts near the lake town that he thought he'd avoided by paying cash. But that still caught him on a parking lot camera with the rope and blocks in his cart. Confronted with the evidence, Adrian shifted from quiet to script, insisting Leah had chosen to disappear, that someone else must have followed them, that he had left the cabin clean because he's tidy. The detectives let him speak. Then they showed him the sonar images, the recovered bag, the SIM card, the seller photos. His face didn't change much, but his voice did. He went from steady to flat, from explanation to fragments. Prosecutors built the timeline like a bridge. Lure with the anniversary trip, isolation at the cabin, temporary containment in the cellar, staged normalcy in the kitchen, the fake text to buy time, the lake disposal, and the cleanup masquerading as neatness. They called expert witnesses to explain how chloroform works, how side-scan sonar reads man-made shapes, and how cash purchases still leave electronic traces through camera metadata and parking lot license plate captures. They brought in Leah's friend to testify about the way Leah texted, the words she used, the punctuation, so the jury could see that the "made it to the lake" message did not sound like her. They had the clerk talk about the boots, the neighbor about the clean truck, the hardware manager about the rope question. The defense tried to argue that the lake could have taken the bag there from a different spot, that someone else could have used Adrian's old family cabin, that the cellar was just storage. But the jury had the map in front of them, and each pin ended with Adrian's name. In the end, the verdict came down to the single thing he thought would protect him: silence. He believed that if no one saw the act and no body surfaced, the world would shrug. But silence cracked under weight. The lake gave up the bag. The hatch left a pattern. The phone left a ghost. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life, the judge calling the plan cold, precise, and designed to erase a human being. For Leah's mother, the hardest detail to hear wasn't the chloroform or the rope. It was the fake message, the way her daughter's voice had been borrowed for a few hours to make everyone stand down. Detectives later said the case changed how they look at neat scenes and quiet men who offer tidy timelines. They learned again that disappearance is not magic. It is work, it is preparation, and it is made of parts that can be found if you keep looking in the water, under the rugs, and between the lines of a text that does not sound like the person who supposedly wrote it. 5 men, 5 betrayals. 5 endings planned long before the first "I love you" was spoken. Some left scenes that screamed their guilt. Others tried to leave nothing at all. But every plan had cracks, and every crack let the truth slip through. Betrayal may have been the trigger, but arrogance was the reason they were caught. Because in the end, the dead can't speak, but the evidence always does.